Thank you for spending a little bit of your time today with me. My name is Roger Clark, and welcome to Tech Talks here. And we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about charts in Excel, a quick guide to charts. Just a couple things as a bit of housekeeping here. First and foremost, if you have questions about charts as we go through this, even if it doesn't necessarily pertain to what I'm talking about at that moment, go ahead and use the questions panel and go to webinar and enter your question there, and I will do my best to get to all of them this afternoon. It's supposed to take about a half hour or so there will be some time for you guys to for me to answer your questions in there. And so what are we going to spend the next little while talking about? We're going to take a look at a couple things about charts, specifically things like data set tips. Your data set is your actual data, ways to organize that, some things, some do's and don'ts that we need to be aware of. We're going to take a look at selecting the data. So it's important when you select your data for your charts to make your life as easy as possible, make Excel's life as easy as possible. We don't want to have to go back and reinvent the wheel. So if we select what we need and we're careful about what we need or what we select, it'll make the chart, the default chart, that much better and give us that much more control over how the chart is designed to look. I'm going to talk about placing your chart. There's a couple different places you can do it. You can put it within the data, but you can also put it on its own sheet. We'll talk about the pros and cons of that. And then finally, the last thing, we're going to talk about editing your chart, some quick tips about editing points on the chart and editing things like that. Now, just so you know, you can literally spend an 8-hour class on charts. I've taught that class before, and there's all these different types of charts, and we literally just have not the time to do it all in this little overview. So be aware that we're going to take a look at just a few things here on charts. So as we get started here, let's start off with the idea of working with your data set here, right? So here I have a data set and some data set tips for us to be aware of. So this is what we call a data set. A data set is a set of data. It is a database. It is what you use to represent everything. Now, the most important thing about working with a data set is to keep the data together. Adding blank rows and columns in your data is a bad idea. If this is how you're set up, I would caution you against this, because now Excel sees what amounts to 4 different data sets here. It sees this contiguous block is one data set, this block is a data set, this is another, and this is another. And it creates huge, not necessarily problems, but it just makes you sort of take away some of the functionality of Excel when it comes to building your data. So be aware of that. And again, I don't like these blank rows and columns in my data. If I need to put a visual space between Adam's row 6 and my total, which is in row 7, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to grab row 7 and I'm just going to make it wider. There's the visual space, but my data is still together, and that's the most important thing here, right, is keeping that data together. Same thing here. I'll make a column wider if I need a space and left align the numbers or do something like that to make sure that my data stays together as much as possible. Okay, so that's the most important thing about working with Excel. Keep your data together. The more contiguous the data, the more effortless Excel does a lot of different things. And if you've seen some of my other tech talks, I talk about things like working with data tables and actually being able to very quickly expand my columns to the right and whatnot, and even as far as the rows are concerned. So keep your data together as much as possible, okay? Next thing I want to address when working with charts is what do we select when I build a chart? So In this example, I've got my sporting goods sales for July, and I've got 3 different categories: the fitness, the biking, and the outdoor. And I got my sales reps, Mr. Smith through Mrs. Adams here, right? So what do we select when I'm working and when I'm building a chart? It's important to understand this, is by default, I only want to select the individual figures. I don't care about the totals in a chart that's dealing with comparisons. So in other words, I'm comparing the fitness to the biking to the outdoor, or conversely, Mr. Smith to Mrs. Brown to Mr. Wallace to Mrs. Adams here. I don't necessarily need the totals. That's not another comparison against the other objects, right? So when you're building a chart, keep in mind what you are actually going to build the chart on. And a little bit there, I'll show you how we can actually take non-contiguous data and actually build a chart from that. So for example, if I want to take a look at just a pie chart of my total sales with the sales reps, I'm going to show you guys how to do that in just a few minutes. So I select the data here, and I'm selected from A2 through D6 there, right? And then I'm going to go to the insert menu because there's no charts in my spreadsheet. So in order to put one in there, I have to insert it, right? And then we have a whole section here on charts. And depending on your monitor's resolution, your computer's resolution, you might see a lot more or fewer options and buttons listed here. And for our purposes, I'm going to work with a 3D column chart. It's the most common thing that I've typically had to do. And I simply select OK. And notice, because we selected the titles, I get a built-in legend: fitness, biking, and outdoor, color coordinated with Smith, Brown, Wallace, and Adams, right? And nice, simple, very easy to go, very easy to do. And because we selected the data, we selected the labels, we selected them as part of this, it knew to bring this in, right? Conversely, then if I only select this as my chart, then my chart is not going to be nearly as effective, because now I just get 1, 2, 3, 4, series 1, 2, 3, and then it falls to me to actually create everything else. But lucky for us, I have this cool trick here where I can grab this guy here and go like that, and go like this up top, and simply add in the parts of the things where, oops, that's not correct. See, aha, I did it wrong. It wants that to be another series, and that's not right. So you know what I'm going to do? Instead of trying to fix all that, let's just delete it, re-highlight it, and remake it. Again, keep your job easy, right? All right, so there's my chart, nice and easy. Okay, now, there are 2 places that a chart can exist on a spreadsheet. A chart can exist on an existing spreadsheet like this, or you can very easily move a chart to its own tab. And if you need to do a lot of editing and you don't want to work in a small window, I would consider putting it on its own sheet. And how you do that is when you have a chart selected, we get on the ribbon up here, we get 2 new categories that exist within the Excel ribbon. If I'm working here, they go away, but when I click on the chart, we pop up, we have chart design and format, and right here on the far right, I have the choice of moving the chart, and you can move a chart to a new sheet, and it is this simple. And then I can actually name this here, for example, July sales. And as if by magic, it appears on its own sheet. Now, part of this is because this is now an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, and it's still using the fonts from the original creation. So this is 14-point text on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, right? And this is 9-point text on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. So it's very small. So there's reasons that that can happen, and we can go in here and edit these things and make them bigger and whatnot. But again, if you put it on its own chart and it's just not manageable, or you realize it's not really what I need, you can always, again, from the chart design ribbon, move the chart back to it as an object in sales, and then position it where you want it to go. Voila, right? And then I'll zoom out just a tad so that you can see most of them at the same time. All right, so that is the idea on that. When it comes to editing a chart, I have a simple philosophy, and that is if you don't know what to do, you right click. This is sort of a Windows philosophy. It holds true to pretty much anything in Windows. So if I want to edit this chart, for example, the title doesn't necessarily have anything, so I can click on that. If I can click on it, I'll just highlight that and call it July sales, and that's not a big deal. But if I want to edit that title, I can right click on it and I can get into the font or edit the text or change everything from here. If, for example, I have well, this is my data with my fitness, my biking, and my outdoor. One of the other things I can do that I like about charts is basically very quickly just switch the row and column. So now I'm comparing my categories and I'm comparing each salesman's sales within each category. My only problem here is I don't like this sort of ugly yellow here. It looks sort of a mustard gas yellow. That's not the most attractive look. So remember I talked about if anything you want to do, you right click. You know what? I'm going to right click on that one series, and notice it actually highlights the whole series by default. And I'm going to change the fill of that series from banana yellow. I'm going to choose sort of a sort of like this darker green there, and change the look of that, and that looks much better. I don't like my legend here on the bottom. I want it on the right hand side. You know what? I select it, I right click, and I'm going to go to Format Legend, and I'm going to put it on the right. And it is that simple, right? So it is as easy as right click and make your change. So if you don't know what to do, you right click. All right, now, what are some of the other things that about charts that I want to talk about here? Most importantly now, if you look at this chart, this is a chart that actually shows that our sales are actually doing pretty well. If I look at this chart and I see these bars that are really tall, I'm thinking things are going great. And I like to use an analogy that talks about, comparing data, right? There is a statistic that says that 28% of all traffic fatalities are caused by drunk drivers. And that's a really powerful statistic, right? However, that also means that 72% of all traffic fatalities are caused by sober drivers. So using that logic, that means there's almost a 3-to-1 chance improvement of me driving drunk. Now, we know that this is not true. I'm obviously being sarcastic here, but it talks about presenting data, right? The data in a chart is a graphic representation of your numbers. Are the numbers telling the story that you want them to tell? I look at this chart visually, and this is telling a heck of a story that my salesmen are killing it. Well, what if they're not? What if our sales are actually down from last year by, let's say, $1,500? We were at $4,000 this time last year. We're not even close to that. How do I make this chart represent that side of the story? How do I tell that story in a way that comes across to my audience? So again, in this case, I'm going to take a look at this idea. I have my scale here, my vertical axis, my y-axis. For those of you who remember high school geometry, we have the x and the y-axis here. My y-axis, I am going to right-click because, again, right-click, and I am going to format the axis. And anytime you make those changes in Excel here, I love the fact that we get this cool pop-up on the right-hand side that makes my life easier. Now, in this case, my minimum is set to 0, which is good. I want my bars to start at the bottom. But my maximum in this case, let's say again, my point is my maximum is supposed to be $4,000. By simply changing the maximum there, now my chart takes on a whole different meaning. It's much more somber look to this data, right? Is this actually telling the story that I wanted to tell? Now, in this case, no. Now I'm looking and saying, okay, now my marketing can say, hey, we need to do some marketing. We need to do something to get these sales up because they're not as good as they were this time last year, right? So this is an example of how we can really make a quick change to the story we're telling with very few clicks. Now, one of the other things that I can do with a chart that's sort of neat is if I want a specific statistic to stand out within this whole thing. Okay, so if I click on one, again, it selects the series, but let's say I want to point out this one data point here, this one serious point. If I click on this set once, I select the series. If I click on one object a second time, now I'm dealing with just that object, right? Just this one part of the series. Be careful here. You don't want it to detract and become separated from the series. But in this case, I'm going to right click and I'm going to add a data label specifically to this one point here. And so now, again, and then I can click on that and I can format that. Can't I format? I thought I could format that for currency. Maybe I can't. Text options. Nope. Oh, I know what I need to do. If I wanted that to stand out. Again, when you work in Excel, I believe if I simply take this and format it for currency, that would solve that problem. Again, the idea is that this is how you edit your data, which again is one of the other things I like to talk about with the charts. Remember that this data is always, always, always pulling its information from this data set, right? So if I need to change a value here, if you look at this and realize that something's wrong, you make the change here. If that's supposed to be 4,000, right, because Mr. Smith did do his job, then you make that change there and your chart will automatically update, right? So again, making those kind of changes, and I'll change this back to, to normal. There. Okay, so this sort of wraps up my quick presentation on how to create charts. Again, just a couple quick recap ideas. Make sure you're selecting your labels with your data. Make sure you're not selecting stuff you don't need, because otherwise, when you click on your chart, is your chart giving you an accurate representation of what you're actually trying to create some comparisons on. So at this point, I want to, again, if you have questions, please feel free to use the questions tab. A couple of things that I wanted to go over here that some people have asked me about. One of them is, but what if my data is non-contiguous here, meaning I want to create a pie chart of this sales data, right? I want to create a pie chart of that. But I want to do it in such a way that I don't want to have to go back and reselect or add in all these labels. Well, this is one of the cool tricks I can do here. I'm actually going to select my sales reps. I'm going to hold down the control key at this point, and now I'm going to select my total sales. Okay, so I have two non-contiguous blocks of data here. So now when I'm going to insert, I'm now going to create a pie chart. And again, I love doing things in 3D. And again, I can, and we have a lot of control here, by the way. I can actually from here, I can do things, for example, like the legend. I can move it to the right. I can add in, for example, data labels. I can do that. And on top of that, I can put them as data callouts thusly, right? And again, notice because I selected the labels, they automatically populate and makes my life better, right? And so at that point, I don't necessarily need the legend because I've got my labels here. So again, I could go back to here and say, you know what? No legend on this particular chart. And I can even go in here and select this part of the wedge and sort of do a call out and pull it out and make it look pretty. And everybody say, ooh, Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of things we can do to make the chart. Again, Excel's doing all the heavy lifting here, but by selecting things the right way, it gives me a lot of control over how to work with my charts. Now, another question that gets popped up a lot is integrating data from Excel, like this chart here. I have the sales chart, and let's go back and make our chart not quite as ominous as it was before. Let's format this axis, and let's bring my scale here. Whoops. Let's bring the scale back down to reset that in there, and things are looking a lot more promising again. So now I want to put this chart inside of a Word document or even inside of an email that I'm sending to somebody else. Now, of course, when you're dealing with email, you are dealing with a lot more static pictures of your data, meaning that I can copy this chart as is, paste it into an email and send it to somebody else, but it's not necessarily going to be dynamic to the person who receives it. Actually, I know that it will not be dynamic to the person who receives it. However, if I'm working on this report that's going to be going through, that's going to be updated over the next several months from some kind of proposal, an ongoing budget proposal or something like that, how can I integrate this into Word seamlessly? I tell people always, use the tool that was designed for the job, right? You don't use a wrench to hammer a nail, right? You use a hammer. So if I'm going to work with data and with the tables of data, I'm going to use Excel. I'm not going to build a table in Word. I'm going to use Excel, and then I can copy my spreadsheet here. So I'm going to copy my chart. And I happen to have a Word document over here for my sales data. And I am going to simply paste that chart. That's the Format Painter button. That's not, no, it is the Paste button. I don't know, that is the Format Painter. That's the Paste button. If you click on the right button, things work better for you in the long run. So I have my chart here linked to my sales, in Word, I have a chart pulling data from Excel. Now, the cool thing about this is by simply doing this in Word, we've linked these two files together. So I'm going to come back to Excel here, and I'm going to save my spreadsheet, and I'm going to close it because I don't need it open anymore. I have everything I need, and I go back to my Word document here. Now, at this point, right, I'm looking at this. I know that some data has gone up behind the scenes, so let me actually go in here quickly. I'll go back to them. I sort of disconnected them, and let's change our sales figures for this back to 3,000, right? Then that needs to be a little taller. So now, did it update in Word automatically at this point? It did not, but that's okay, right? So I'll make my change here. I'll save out of this, and I'll reclose my spreadsheet with my new numbers in there. Now, I'm looking at this. Anytime I open this file, what I need to do here, now, if I close this file, it should automatically update when I open it back up. Theoretically, textbook communism is a perfect form of government. And so we saw here that in this case, theoretically, it did not update automatically because we know in practice it never works. But the cool thing is, all I have to do here is select my chart. I'm going to, again, if you don't know what to do, you right click. I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to go down here and find, where is, is it chart design? Where is my, I'm going to go here and edit my data in Excel. And as soon as I do this, it's going to reopen that spreadsheet in Excel. And did you notice that that column, that first column, immediately jumped because it updated itself? It opened up, notice, quick guide to charts, the file I was working on, it opened it up. While they're both open, now they're back to being dynamic with each other, so that if I make a change, oops, that's the wrong one I edited. This is the one I edited. This is supposed to be 1800 as well. When I make that change, now that the two files are open, again, they're going to go ahead and they're dynamic. As long as both files are open, you've got a dynamic link. If they're not, if the Excel spreadsheet is not open, you can right click on it and then open it back up and make changes to it. So again, that cool dynamic link that you have built in. Okay, so again, if I need to change any numbers, if I need to change any formatting, I'm going to edit that data here. I'm going to make these changes, again, typically inside of Excel, so that I can go in and format that back as a currency sign or whatever I want to do, so that I want my data update. So again, all your changes are done in Excel because in fact you're pulling the data from one source. And we like this idea, right? I don't want to have to make changes in point A and point B and point C and point D where I've got to copy it all over the place. I like the idea of, I make the change, we tie these two together, we link them together so that we don't have to go in and reinvent the wheel. Okay? So that at this point, that sort of brings me to the end of this particular presentation. I appreciate you spending some of your time with me this afternoon. If you have questions after the fact, just know first off that this webinar will be on the website for CPS. And if you have questions, I'll make sure that my email address is attached to that so that you guys can reach out to me, and I'll do what I can to make sure these questions get get answered for you as soon as possible. And I will follow up as fast as I can. I'll make sure we get you the answers to your questions. So I appreciate your time this afternoon. This recording, again, the organizers are going to send out a link with to the recording itself and to a way to access it. So thank you for spending time with me this afternoon. You guys don't work too hard, and I'm going to excuse myself. Have a good afternoon.